All right. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for what is the second seminar of three in our Strategic Human Capital Interest Group Spring Seminar Series. This time, we're going to be talking about pandemic effects. This was one of the subjects that you guys indicated in the survey that you'd like to hear about. So obviously, we're in the middle of, or hopefully just coming out of a pandemic, and it's touched everybody in some ways, including organizations and employees. And so we figured we would focus on two important topics that are relevant to our interest group. One of those is how has the pandemic impacted inequality in the workplace? And then the other one is focusing on this kind of new policy of working from anywhere, which organizations have started to use, but the pandemic has really accelerated. And really, we want to kind of examine these two topics, thinking about the next 10 years of research. And so we are truly fortunate to have two world-class scholars in this field to come and guide us through our talk. So we have Sarah Kaplan, who's the Distinguished Professor of, there she is waving, of Gender and the Economy and Professor of Strategic Management at the Rotman School, University of Toronto, and Raj Choudhury, who's the Lumley Family Associate Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. So very quickly, before I let Sarah jump in, the way this is going to work is we're going to split the session into two. So Sarah's going to present first for around 15-20 minutes, and then we'll break out into breakout rooms. I'll give you some more instructions at that time. There'll be a Google document which you'll have access to, and then after that we will reconvene and talk about the points. One final point is my co-host for today is Sam Conroy. Give a wave, Sam, from the Colorado State University. And Rep Bryan is with us also. He's the third of three in terms of organizing this seminar. So I won't hold you up anymore. I'd like to invite Sarah to come and share her slides, and the virtual floor is yours, Sarah.
I'm muted, so now I am unmuting myself. Great, I'm going to share my screen. Voila. So thank you all so much for joining on this conversation, and I'm really excited to share just some thought starters, because the most interesting part, I think, is going to be the chance for us in the breakout groups to really talk through what are the implications for our own research. And I see so many friends in the audience, so it's great to see you joining. And for those of you I don't know, I'm excited to hear your ideas from the breakouts. So I'm going to talk about the equity impact of the pandemic in very broad strokes. I know there's a lot of research going on about it, and that started the moment the pandemic started and is continuing today. And I'll nod to some of that, but mainly I'm going to talk in broader strokes about what I think this means for our own research. So, and the pitch that I've been making, and I make this pitch to academics and I make this pitch to policymakers, I would say I'm an American immigrant to Canada and now a Canadian citizen. And one nice thing about Canada is a fairly small country population-wise, not geographically. And as a result, it's in some ways much easier to have access to policymakers there than in the United States. And so I've spent a lot of time talking to policymakers, and I'll tell you a little bit about the impacts that we've been able to have by bringing our research insights, our academic research insights, to policy, which I think is a really important path. So let me just start by talking about, in particular, gender equality, but I'm going to talk about it in a very intersectional way. Many people have talked about the pandemic as creating, on the economic front, a she-cession. 63% of pandemic job losses were experienced by women. Women's employment has not returned to pre-COVID levels, or in some cases it has, but there's a question about whether the quality of jobs that they are returning to is the same as the quality of job that they left. And this is in part because cuts were in women-dominated sectors, sometimes called the 5C sectors of caring, cleaning, catering, clerical work, cashiering, and caring includes, childcare and things like that. And part of the reason, the other reason that women's employment is, of course, dropped is that there has been a lack of affordable and safe care services. A lot of childcare centers closed, schools closed, and we have a very gendered notion in our society about who should be taking care of children at home. And so when the increased demands on caregiving at home happened, it was much more likely that women are the ones who have taken on the burden, to the point that they have often had to drop out of their jobs because they simply couldn't manage this at the same time. And this is particularly true for single head of household families, which are most often, single head of household are most often women, women of color, immigrant women. And so those women have been the most particularly affected by the she-cession. There was a little moment of hope at the beginning of the pandemic. Researchers were able, who were doing kind of time use studies, were able to document that in heterosexual households where there was a man and a woman and there were children, that they found initially in the first few months of the pandemic, when we were all sort of in shock at the shutdowns and things like that, that men dramatically increased their participation in care work at home and other household activities. And so everyone got very excited about this was going to be the true moment when we were going to see this shift in caring responsibilities at home that we thought maybe would have huge long-term repercussions in terms of expectations in the workplace as well as expectations at home. But the moment that things started to open up and people figured out how to do work from home better and things like that, actually men's participation in care work at home went back to pre-pandemic levels, and women's has not. Women's can't not. If men's go back, women's can't, because someone has to be taking care of the kids when they're out of school, either because school is closed or because the kids are having to self-isolate or whatever because they've been exposed. So we're seeing a really dramatic shift in terms of the economic impact on women. And also we know that especially women of color are really experiencing a lot of those losses. We see that one of the drivers of a lot of, for example, in Canada, we've had a terrible crisis in the pandemic in the long-term care homes for elderly and people with disabilities. The death rates were truly staggering. It was very tragic. And one of the reasons that happened is because the workers in those care homes are underpaid, do not have sick leave, and therefore we're working in multiple care homes in order to put everything together, or we're working in a care home and as a job, and as an essential worker in another setting like cashiering at a grocery store. And so they were the vectors to transmit a lot of to bring COVID into these long-term care homes. But the reason they were vectors is because they are poorly paid, because the jobs are not structured well, because they don't have sick leave. And so these are all kinds of things that I think can be addressed by academics in thinking about the nature and structure of jobs. Okay, so just to keep track of my time, I also wanted to comment specifically on women's entrepreneurship, because even prior to the pandemic, when looking at the issues of economic inclusion of women, people were very often likely to champion women's entrepreneurship as a potential solution. I've never been a big fan of that, because I think entrepreneurship for people who would rather have a job with benefits is not a great outcome, but many people are forced into it, again, because of the structure of work that doesn't allow women to be able to, work a job and do their responsibilities at home. But we found, the research has shown that women entrepreneurs are more likely to be in the affected sectors, the sectors affected by the pandemic, like tourism or services, more likely to have to assume more care work at home simultaneously. And many of the recovery programs that were put in place were not tailored to women's businesses, which are likely to be smaller, have fewer employees, so maybe they didn't benefit from some of the salary top-ups. They might not be incorporated. They were often, women are often self-financed because they've been excluded from traditional financing methods. So we see here that even women's entrepreneurship is not like a magic solution to some of the dynamics that we've been seeing, and they've been hurt as much or worse than even women in employment. So what has brought us to this point? People typically say it took a pandemic for the country to see what was already broken. There's nothing that the pandemic has done that wasn't already existing in our society. And what it has done is exacerbated those schisms. And I think, opened everyone's eyes. We're talking about policymakers, regular citizens, and us academics as to how some of the structures of our society have contributed to the impact of the pandemic. People have talked about the fact that there's no natural disaster is just a natural disaster. It's also basically a management disaster or a social disaster, because, for example, an earthquake in Haiti will have a completely different impact than an earthquake in Los Angeles because of the differences in resources, the differences in ability to create, good buildings and adhere to the standards and things like that. So the same thing can be said about the pandemic around the world. So this has been a system that consistently disadvantaged women, low wage workers, migrants, racialized people, and other marginalized communities. And the pandemic has just, put that on steroids. Think about how you get food to your table. Migrant farm workers in Canada and the United States, for sure, and I guess probably all over Europe as well, people without any benefits, very little status, no paid sick leave. It's, this is what, and then we sit at home getting our grocery delivery by someone who's also in a gig economy job that has, everyone's saying, oh, well, the gig economy is hiring and that's great. Well, the gig economy is terrible if you look at whether there's job security, whether there's benefits, and the kinds of things that might happen in a regular type of employment. So I've been advocating for what I call a caring recovery. I've written about it a lot in a more popular press, and emphasizing here not caring in the broadest swath of the term, thinking about not just care work and things like that, but also caring for our planet, using environmental care as part of the recovery. And in fact, just to give you a sense of the ways that research can be mobilized to have an impact on policies, at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, which I run, we partnered with YWCA Canada to launch author the first feminist economic recovery plan for any country in the world. It followed on the heels of the state of Hawaii, who had done one before us. And what we did in that report was mobilize all the research that had been done on these dynamics, and we're able to translate that into practice. You can see it if you are interested in it, but we pushed for a number of things that I think are the kinds of issues that we as scholars can also push to address. Again, starting with intersectionality, that is thinking about doing all of our research, in this case, thinking about all policy in terms of the intersections between gender, race, immigrant status, disability, and other features. We tend not to do that, or maybe we just break something out by race, or we just break something out by gender, and then only the gender binary, because we never think about the fact that gender exists on a spectrum. So really using that to understand the power in the system. Dealing with, again, relatedly, systemic racism, thinking about care work as an essential part of the economy in ways that it often isn't, and devalued, investing in good jobs, not maybe the gig jobs that I was talking about. Fighting the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. Again, we tend not to think of gender-based violence as something that we would address in business schools or in management research, but in fact, there are big impacts of gender-based violence on women's ability to have and keep jobs if they have to move to get away from a violent situation, to be able to be steady in their work, there's lots of issues. And then of course, for companies, it's expensive if you have employees who are unable to come, or there's a lot of employee turnover. So issues like this, which we don't normally think about as management issues, I'm encouraging us to think about as management issues. Thinking about bolstering small businesses and not just focusing on large corporates, or even on entrepreneurial, when we talk about entrepreneurship, we tend to focus on high-tech, high-growth entrepreneurship, but in fact, small businesses employ most people. In Canada, 91% of private sector employees are employed in small and medium-sized businesses. So, really putting our attention where the economy is. And then strengthening infrastructure and diverse voices, which I won't necessarily go into in detail here. I just want to point out that one of the things that happened as a result of this advocacy, not just my own, but many people's, is that in Canada, we just got a massive, massive investment in developing a national childcare infrastructure that would be affordable $10 a day childcare for every single child. This is going to be a massive change in the structure of society in Canada. I know a lot of European countries already have this kind of thing. The United States is very far behind that. But one of the ways we were able to convince policymakers, and this is Chrystia Freeland, our Minister of Finance, I spent quite a bit of time with her, was showing her the academic research that, pointed out how childcare actually pays massive dividends, not only back to the government, but also to businesses in terms of growth, to employment, and all kinds of other outcomes that are really desirable. And it was an example of mobilizing academic research to actually influence policy. And we don't talk enough about care work and the caring economy in our own research, and I think it's a huge missing gap. So let me just conclude with a few slides about what I think we need to do as scholars, and then I'm hoping this is spur for conversation in our breakout groups. One is, I think we really need new dependent variables. At the macroeconomic level, people are obsessed with GDP growth. I've spent a lot of time thinking about gender issues, obviously, and everyone's like, if we had more economic inclusion of women, we would grow the GDP by $21 billion or whatever it is. They always come up with numbers like that, but it's just not clear to me that GDP is the only or the most important measure, just like I'm not sure that total returns to shareholders is the only or most important measure when we think about firm performance. Really expanding our thinking to thinking about marginalized communities, good jobs with decent income, decent leave, how we are valuing unpaid care work, how many affordable housing units are created, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of different kinds of dependent variables, and I think this would translate into the firm level as well. And, I'm fascinated by two kind of recent forays into thinking about these different kind of dependent variables. Stephanie Kelton, who's popularized modern monetary theory. She didn't originate it, but she's definitely been one of the key proponents of it, that suggests we don't need to worry so much about deficits in the government, that it's much better to work for employment and other sources of economic welfare. Or Catherine Rayworth's work on donut economics, which if you haven't heard about it, they now have a donut lab, which is very exciting. But the donut, which you can see kind of in this image, basically says that you have in the donut on the inside is bounded by the social foundation of what people need to, what individual people need to survive and thrive. And the external part of the donut is the ecological ceiling, which is what our planet can bear. And that you change your notion of what your important dependent variables are if you think about, if you see it through the lens of donut economics. And, both of these theories are poo-pooed by classical economists. I've even had, when I invited Stephanie Kelton to give a talk at Rotman, I even had a junior male colleague tell me my reputation would be destroyed and the school would be ashamed if we had her come and speak. People are very resistant. People under the traditional system are very resistant to thinking about alternative DVs, but I think that that's sort of our responsibility. And then I want to just conclude with some thoughts about what we can do as scholars beyond, my final bullet point there is rethink the dependent variable, but other things that we might want to think about as we push forward our work. For example, rethinking work. And I know we're going to hear more about that from Raj, so I don't want to jump on that too much, but I think that's why our talks dovetail so nicely. But now that we've had this experiment with working from home, a lot of the accommodations that I now have, my whole setup here in my little loft in my cottage in Cape Cod, were things that people with disabilities had been asking for years. And companies always said, it's too expensive. We can't make it work. We can't have remote workers and things like that. And it turns out we can, and it's fine. And so thinking about how some of the experiments that we've been running are actually going to lead us to be much more inclusive. I have a team working with me at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, and we had one teammate who worked from 7 until 1 because her spouse had the kids in the morning and then she was going to take the kids in the afternoon. Another teammate who was working partly on the weekend, partly during the week. we would never have allowed the university would never have allowed that previously. And now it's just like, yeah, this is how we work. And so I think we're going to hear more from Raj, but just rethinking work and rethinking what that means for understanding organizations. And there's a lot more to say about that. Also, rethinking procurement and the whole supply chain. We've seen, like right now, you can't build a house really because the supply chain for wood and other construction materials is just completely messed up by the pandemic, and everything is 3 or 4 times the costs, So that is going to have implications for affordable housing and all kinds of things like that. So rethinking procurement and supply, also in terms of sourcing from women-owned businesses or small businesses or things like that. Probably a lot of you in the room here have thought about hiring and promotion issues as it relates to strategic human capital. Again, I think we're going to have to look at that very differently with so many women dropping out of the workforce because of the pandemic. Are we really going to let those careers just completely get derailed, or are we going to have some way to, call the brakes, sabbaticals, get people right back on track, not allow people to lose their human capital or lose their ability to contribute and in society? And in particular, if we think about the ongoing push to get more women and people of color, greater diversity and representation in leadership, then of course we're going to have to do something very different coming out of the pandemic. The other thing I've been really pushing on is rethinking product and service design. A lot of people don't appreciate how products and services actually embed gender and racialized, basically embed some forms of discrimination. Like a lot of us probably took to the Fitbit during the pandemic in order to be able to, get more exercise and make sure we got our steps in. Well, it turns out that Fitbits don't actually work that well on people with darker skin because of the way that it's basically a green light that shines into your body to take things like your heart rate and things like that. And yet, that was just a design flaw because no one actually thought about testing this thing on anything other than the white skins of the people who were the designers. And so I've been thinking a lot about how we can, rethink product and service design in ways that would actually make the products and services more inclusive. I've done a lot of work also on rethinking governance. I put out a report just recently called 360 Governance to follow on my book, The 360 Corporation. And I can I'll put some links in the Zoom chat of just some resources for you on that. But, if, there's a lot of attention to, for example, women on boards, and things are going to have to really change if we're going to actually make real progress on that. But also corporate governance is going to have to change to take into account the new expectations on organizations. Coming out of the pandemic, I think people are no longer going to tolerate companies not doing the right thing in society, and there's going to be increased social pressure for that. So those are just some starting points in terms of what I think we as scholars can be working on. Any of the rethinks there are things that I'm hoping that you all will be working on. And I look forward to hearing what you discuss in your breakouts based on this. And these links that are here, I'm going to just put into the chat for you as well. So let me stop sharing and learn what we're doing next.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I know that I went to a breakout room and we had a really interesting conversation, and I think we could have talked for another hour probably or more. So now the plan for this next 15 to 20 minutes is for Sarah and Raj as well to reflect on the comments that were coming in the Google Doc, and also to answer questions if there are any specific questions you all have. So we're gonna let them reflect and then and share their thoughts with everyone. And feel free to type in questions as you have them in the chat. And if we have time, we'll try to address those as well before we transition to the next presentation. So I'm gonna turn it over to Sarah to talk about her thoughts on looking over the document.
Great. And Raj, hopefully too, because we were having a very productive conversation, although I see his video is not on right at the moment. Yeah, you're back, Raj. Oh, you changed location. Yeah. Good. So are you going to pin us are you going to pin us or something? Anyway, so first of all, I am so impressed with what you all came up with. Raj and I were talking as it was appearing in the Google Doc in such a short period of time, so many rich things. I almost feel like I don't necessarily want to comment because it's all so good. But I was thrilled to see people talking about some of the different structural elements that are contributing, that seem neutral, that actually are contributing to inequality, such as algorithm-driven job design, that may be exacerbating these things, or access to technology. I just think I've become more and more convinced that, the systems that we operate in are not neutral. Capitalism is not neutral. So this talk that I gave at Harvard yesterday was all about race, capitalism, and democracy. And if you look at the history of certainly North American capitalism, it is built on the foundation of settler colonialism and slavery, right? I mean, that is the origin. And race scholars will tell you that racism was sort of invented to justify that system. So if we don't problematize the systems that we're in and understand how they are built on discrimination or on inequality, I think we won't be able to make progress. So I love that so many of you were talking about that. I love the question. There's two pina colada groups, pina colada and then the real one, but I'm looking at pina colada. What is strategic in inequality? And I think this question about what should be done, which is the normative versus how things are done, the positive, I think is really important. And, as scholars, we may have normative viewpoints, but what we're supposed to be doing is the scholarly work of just trying to explain the world. But I think our choices about how we, what we look at to explain are really important. And so if we look at the, wrong questions and understanding how things are done, we're not going to get to a solution. So I'm not advocating for us to all become super normative. Like I wear multiple hats. One of them is as a scholar and the other is as a translator, right? And in my translational work and in my advocacy work, I'm using academic research and saying to people, what you're doing doesn't make sense if you actually pay attention to the academic research. And so this was not meant to say we should be being normative or advocates. We can all do that as well. But I think even choosing to do the how things are actually done, the positive part, there are lots of ways that our choices about what we research will shape, can shape the whole field. And so all of these other questions that are out there are just wonderful in terms of thinking about, now I'll go to pina colada, the real one, as opposed to pina colada, this idea of empathy for the essential workers. Why are we not doing massive amounts of research on how organizations are treating essential workers, as an example? Just our choice of what topics to study, I think, is hugely important. So I love that. So many other groups. I'll comment on FANTA, women's entrepreneurship. I prefer women's to female. Female has some problems when you talk about females. It's not as great. Women's entrepreneurship, push rather than pull. Oh, I put in the chat on supply side versus demand side views of gender. It's a little paper that Isabel Fernandez Mateo and I wrote, because I think a lot of times we confuse supply side issues for demand, or demand side issues for supply side issues. We think women are not choosing to be entrepreneurs, for example, when in fact they're rationally looking at a world that's hugely discriminatory, that doesn't give them capital, that doesn't give them resources, and then they're not doing it. But is that a demand side problem or a supply side problem? And yet people think it's supply side, and then their answer is we need more training for women, right? So when you write your papers, you might be looking at something about entrepreneurship, but always at the end, we put some part where we say what it might be for practice. If we write about that gap in women's entrepreneurship, and then at the end we say women need more training, we're falling into that trap of using our interpretive skills in ways that are actually unproductive for understanding the true structural issues. And so I think that's why I really want to emphasize always thinking about the structures that shape the behaviors that we're observing. Okay, I'll stop for a minute because Raj, I know you had some reactions too, and then I'm going to keep reading.
Sure. So like everyone else, I learned a lot from Sarah's talk and from the discussion. So I guess I'm the traditional reviewer too, only this time I get to say good things, not like point out. So, the two things that really, spoke to me was Sarah's point, and I think people were discussing this in the breakout, about how as strategic human capital scholars, we can expand our DVs. So what is firm performance? And I think that's such a rich question. And Sarah was suggesting there could be an SMJ special issue just on that question. What is firm performance? What are some DVs we as scholars could consider? The second thing I think that really struck me as very insightful was the discussion in Fanta, the point about how the firms leveraging diversity could be more than tokenism, and it could really be value enhancing. And I was immediately reminded of Jordan Siegel's work, which many of you probably know about, how multinationals in Korea have really created value by hiring women because domestic firms would not. And I think as strategic human capital scholars, I think that's something we could probably expand more on. But this is not my topic, so over to you, Sarah, again. And I'm learning like everyone else.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Again, this idea of the use of minorities by firms for strategic means. I think we have to, I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that the SMJ just pulled a paper that had come out about Black people on boards of directors. And the primary reason it was pulled was not necessarily for the core of the empirical analysis, but for the interpretation that was offered that was deeply racist, basically. And I think we have to be very careful. I mean, if we're going to talk about things like using minorities by firms for strategic means, like that's really, really problematic as a language. I'm not saying that firms aren't doing it. I think firms probably are doing that. I mean, for sure, for women on boards, there's a lot of signaling going on and things like that. But we as scholars, even if we're going to research that phenomenon, we have to be very careful that we don't feed into sexist or racist ways of interpreting that, and that we have our analytical hat on and are able to say, well, this is what they say, and then problematize it without feeding into it. And I think what the risk that we have in, even the term human capital, I know this group is called strategic human capital, but human capital has its own like hugely racist origins, right? In terms of the risks around that term. So I think we have to be very thoughtful about, I think that's actually a really interesting question, how firms might be strategically using minorities, but like that's, that needs to be problematized as you talk about it, even if you're going to talk about it. So that's the only thing I would say is like, how can we do this work that we're talking about without further exacerbating the inequalities that we're talking about by the way that we talk about it? And I think that's something that we all just have to be very attentive to, not treating people as human capital, like as, just goods. There's a wonderful book called Keywords by John Patrick Leary, The New Language of Capitalism. And it talks about one of the keywords it talks about as human capital, which I looked up this morning because I wanted to mention this. I think, and it just helps us understand kind of how our language, even the terms that we use, might be perpetuating some of these issues that we're concerned about here in this wonderful discussion in the chat. So that's just one other reaction that I have to this. I don't know, is anybody, I mean, I know there's a big group of us, but is there anybody in the breakouts who wants to have a particular intervention on something that happened in your group that you think would be useful to share with the whole group? I think we're able to, have you just unmute and talk if you're.
Yeah, we've got time for one or two quick questions before handing over to Raj, for sure.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody just had some burning point or comment that they wanted to make, or you're all happy being off video and just.
I'll pose one that we were unable to really dive into, but really we had one of our members who is in a geographic location where things have opened up again.
Right.
And so there was this opportunity to kind of say like, oh, what's the future of work? And like, this person was in the future. And one of the things that they noted was kind of going back to normal. right? And so there is, I think, an opportunity to look to say like, oh, these changes, but there are areas that are going back to normal. And so we can look to see to what extent have they really changed, or are we really heading back to because this new normal phrasing has been interesting, but I've always been a little wary of like, yeah, that we say that now, but once people are truly no longer worried about COVID, will we see these things go,
Well, that's really fascinating. And I think for those of you who care about trying to find instruments and things like that, or natural experiments, maybe this uneven opening of different things might be really useful to do. The point that I like to make is that the old normal was not that awesome. The old normal was, had all these inequalities that we've been talking about, all these lack of opportunities for people. And so this yearning for the old normal is I think misplaced. And I also agree with you, Sekou, that it's this system is designed to maintain the current status hierarchies. And so it will be very, I mean, we saw coming out of the 2008, 2009 crisis, like we basically got an exacerbation of inequalities, not a fixing of that. So I am worried, like you and your group, that we're going to not use this window of opportunity. That's why I was so excited when Canada came up with the childcare plan. I was like, oh, because I told Minister Freeland, we have a window and it's like 3 months long. And if you don't get this out, we're going to lose the window because we're going to lose the will. And so that's why I think we literally have this moment right now to reorient from a policy standpoint. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how. I agree. I don't know how much I won't go back to the new normal. I like working in my pajamas. I mean, I did a lot anyway. That's the joy of being an academic, but now I've maximized the pajama factor. But not everyone has I live a life of extraordinary privilege. Not everyone has that privilege.
All right. So I think we are just done. So Sarah, really thank you so much for what was a really stimulating presentation and discussion, and thanks to everyone who participated in that. And I second the working in pajamas and teaching in a t-shirt and a hoodie. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So we're gonna switch now to Raj. We're going to go through the same format here. So Raj is someone who's doing some really interesting work on working from anywhere and really kind of taking this conversation beyond simply working from home. And he's got some recent publications in SMJ and Harvard Business Review. And so we are really thankful that he's here to give his thoughts on what could be the future of organizations, and maybe, is this acceleration that we've seen in the pandemic, could it be a good thing, or are there risks? So Raj, I'm just going to hand over to you to let you do your thing.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks everyone. So let me just share my screen. Can you guys see the slides? Cool. So I'll just briefly talk about some research for 20 odd minutes, and then would love to get your thoughts. I think I've been waiting for that. As John said, the phenomena I've been studying for a while now actually is something that I've called work from anywhere. And so today, broadly, I'll talk about two things. My research on value creation, because we are strategy scholars, and then my research on this process model for work from anywhere. So the research started with my work with the US Patent Office back in 2015-16. But then subsequently, I've worked with very large organizations such as TCS, Tata Consulting Services, but also much smaller, all remote organizations such as GitLab, Zapier, Doist, Mob Squad, which is actually a Canadian startup. And my more recent work is with Tulsa Remote, on which Tomas, who's on the call, is also a part. So the first thing, as John said, I would conceptually sort of define what work from anywhere is. And as John said, it's not work from home. So work from home is when we are working 3 days from home, but going to an office maybe a couple of days a week. So we are still living in the same city where the organization has an office. And so this is a picture from Nick Bloom et al.'s QJE paper, which sort of describes what work from home is. And now we all know. So I used to use this picture prior to the pandemic. And then work from anywhere is where you could be working from home. You could be working from a co-working space or from Starbucks, but you have now the flexibility to live in a city or town where you want to live. So you are relocating. And so initially I call this live and work anywhere. And theoretically, what we argue in the SMJ paper is that work from anywhere gives a worker geographic flexibility. You can choose which geography you want to live in. And so this is a map from the US Patent Office, which showed where, so as everyone knows, their office is located in Alexandria, Virginia, but these dots represent where workers actually moved. So a bunch of people moved to Florida, California, you can imagine the whole set of locations. So this is the SMJ paper, which was, I think, published online last year. It's available, I think it was published in print earlier this year, joint work with Cyrus Faruqi, a doctoral student, and Barbara Larson at Northeastern. And we try to estimate the productivity effects of work from anywhere. So this is where these examiners, US patent examiners, were living. The research question was, what happens to productivity when the worker moves from a work from home program? So the baseline is WFH, and then they're moving to a work from anywhere program. And so mechanistically, work from home is giving you temporal flexibility. It's giving you a quieter environment. There's less commute. Work from anywhere could give you all of that. In addition, it's giving you the flexibility to choose geography. And so as strategic human capital scholars, the way we theorize is that there's a literature in migration which talks about how workers can derive satisfaction if they are able to exercise their preference on where to live. And building on Soerman and Cohen and others, we essentially say that that non-pecuniary incentive could create more utility for the worker, leading the worker to exert more effort. And that's something we estimate in the paper. And then I'll give a shout out to DK's wonderful paper on firm-specific incentives. And we argue in the SMJ piece that if work from anywhere is a firm-specific incentive, i.e. it's only offered by a few firms, it's an incentive in short supply, then this effect might be especially more salient. And so the empirical context is the US Patent Office implemented work from home in 2006. So they were way ahead of the curve. And then January 2012, they implemented work from anywhere. And the cool thing about that transition was there was a natural experiment. So they have a union of examiners, POPA, and POPA negotiated for the first 2 years, 2012 and 2013, a month-wise quota for how many workers could make that transition. So examiners are self-selecting, but the treatment timing is exogenous. So I'll not go through the details of the empirics. We are able to establish that the treatment timing was random. This table does that. I'll not bore you with the details. And what we find is that there's a productivity gain of 4.4% on average. So this is the month-wise productivity point estimate. This is a within examiner estimation. So productivity, as you can see, goes up and it stays up. So there's no reversion back to where it was. And then we run a bunch of robustness checks. This is a placebo distribution of the treatment effect, which shows that it's a very robust effect. We rule out a bunch of other mechanisms, which I'm not going to talk about. And we essentially show that the effect is driven by effort. And the way we estimate this is we show that 4.4% increase in productivity is directed towards examining first round revisions. So just like our R&R process, they have a multi-round examination in the patent office. So examiners are examining more first round revisions, which is more effort exerting than subsequent round revisions. So that's this paper. Beyond this paper, the way I've thought about it is work from anywhere creates value for firms and individuals in multiple ways. So for firms, there could be these productivity gains. I'm not saying it's going to happen in all kinds of firms. There's a 2-page discussion in our paper about scope conditions. And I would love for others to examine these effects in other settings. But at least in our setting, we found the 4.4% productivity gain. The two other things I want to highlight, which might be interesting questions to study, is whether work from anywhere now enables firms to hire from anywhere. So you don't have to hire only from the local labor market where you had an office. Could you find talented programmers in Kenya? Could you now find talented option traders in Poland? Could you find talent in Bangladesh? And I think that's a real opportunity for firms and also for us as strategic human scholars to think about. Building on Sarah's talk, I've thought about inclusion a lot, and I'll just mention a few anecdotes about what I've heard in my field interviews. So my initial work at the patent office, part of it was focused on military spouses. And they said that they never were able to have any continuity in their careers before work from anywhere, because the spouse was constantly moving and they had to find a job in every new location. So this could have an effect on dual career couples. The second point about inclusion was, I did some work with a large investment bank last year, and the women, the interns who were like interning virtually in that setting, said that one of the women there said she was an intern in the physical internship in 2018. And then she came back in 2020 again in the virtual internship. And she said that her mentorship levels had gone up dramatically. And this is the reason why. In the physical internship, quote unquote, she said, the boys were jostling for space in front of the trader's terminal. And she never got really great mentorship. But in the virtual setting, the senior trader just shared the Zoom screen. So everyone could see the trades all throughout the day sitting at home. And that created a level playing field for mentorship. And I found that really intriguing, and I thought I'll share that story with you, whether this creates a more level playing field for being mentored or onboarding and so on and so forth. And then of course, there are real estate and utility savings. But as strategic human capital scholars, I would say these are the two most interesting things to me. Does work from anywhere enable firms to attract talent from more locations? And does it create a more inclusive workforce? I'll quickly talk about the process model research I've been doing. So one of the interesting models I'm exploring is the hybrid model. And if you are interested in this, there's a case study I've written with TCS. This is a giant company, 500,000 employees worldwide. And they have decided, they had 16 campuses. And they have decided now, to Seku's point, they have embraced the new normal, and they have embraced this model where every worker now would be only 25% in a physical office. So they're calling the model 25-25. So everyone starting from the CEO to the person who joined yesterday. And it's a great story of how they're leveraging the pandemic to make this transformation. One of the problems that you encounter when you work from anywhere is time zones. So, and we all have experienced this in the past few months. So with Jasmina Chauvin and Tommy Pang, a doctoral student, we did a exploration of the time zone problem on communication, and we exploit daylight savings, because daylight savings exogenously changes the temporal distance between locations. And we found the headline finding is, when there is less temporal overlap, there is less synchronous communication. So calls like what we're having right now. So that is a scope condition of work from anywhere. The ability to have synchronous calls is affected by time zones. As a solution to that problem, I investigated what GitLab does. So GitLab is an all remote organization. They don't have any offices ever. 1,350 people all working remotely all over the world. And they focus on two mechanisms to navigate the time zone problem. They focus a lot on asynchronous communication, where they are communicating on Slack channels and they don't have to be on calls for everything. And this takes care of their Zoom fatigue problem. But arguably, this also leads to more thoughtful conversations, and more introverts speaking, because in meetings, extroverts can take over the entire conversation. But the second thing that GitLab does is they codify knowledge like no other company. They have a 5,000-page handbook where they write down everything related to procedural knowledge. And I found this really interesting. And with Thorsten, who I know is on this call as well, we have developed a theoretical model leveraging the concept of stigmergy on how this codification could be different from top-down codification. So stigmergy, many of you probably know what stigmergy is, but it's a process model in biology about how ants build their nests, and termites build their nests. And we argue that they can be a bottom-up stigmergic knowledge codification process that helps work from anywhere. The final thing I'll talk about is my research on virtual water coolers. So even on this meeting, I think someone said, but what about informal face-to-face conversations? So the argument we make in this research is that going back to Tom Allen's work from the 1970s, research has shown that yes, we have serendipitous physical conversations face-to-face, but it's only with people within the 25-meter radius of our physical office. So if you're sitting in a different floor or a different building, I only talk to my Tom colleagues at HPS. I never have a water cooler conversation with my finance colleagues who sit in Baker Library. But in the virtual setting, you can break those boundaries. You can break the boundaries of teams, of hierarchy, of functional areas. And this is an experiment we ran with Goldman Sachs last year, where we had these randomized interactions between interns and very senior managers. And the headline finding is that that treatment condition outperforms every other condition in our research with respect to both performance and the probability of getting a job offer at the end of the internship. So I would encourage people to think about virtual water coolers in your research mix as well. So this is my final slide. So what are some possible research questions for us as a group? And by no means, this is the only list. I'm actually waiting to learn about what you guys come up with. So given what Seku said, there's going to be heterogeneity in how firms embrace WFA, work from anywhere. So there'll be some firms in the new normal which embrace work from anywhere for all employees. This week, Google said they're going to do it for 25% employees will be completely remote. And then all other employees will have work from anywhere for 1 month every year, 4 weeks. And then some firms like JP Morgan and their CEO said, no, everyone has to come back to office. So there's going to be variation, and it'll be fascinating to study how this variation affects strategic human capital outcomes with respect to not only performance, but retention of employees, turnover to competitors, and so on and so forth. The second thing I'll point out, there's a very active debate, even within firms that are embracing work from anywhere, about should salary be set to the task or to the location. So there'll be variation on that as well in the economy. And it'll be fascinating to see which form of compensation setting leads to better strategic human capital outcomes. It'll be interesting to study how work from anywhere affects entrepreneurship outcomes, but also migration outcomes. So one thing I've argued in a New York Times op-ed is that work from anywhere can now help reverse brain drain. So for decades, we've seen talent flow from smaller towns to the coastal cities, from emerging markets to the West. And now work from anywhere can help reverse that. So that's the work I'm doing with Tulsa Remote. It's a fascinating organization in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is attracting remote workers to the town. And they've already moved 750 families. So with that, I'll stop. The final call out, I'll say there's a AOM PDW we're organizing. So Victoria Sevchenko, who's also part of the Strategic Human Capital IG. So me and Vicky, we're organizing, and we'll have Nick Bloom, Pam Hines, Tarun, Fanish, and Nancy. So if you have a remote work paper, please apply. So with that, I'll stop sharing and look forward to the conversation.
So we're going to do this very similarly as we did the prior section. So let's start with letting Raj reflect on the comments and Sarah as well. And again, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to those as well.
Yeah, Samantha, I was actually thinking, if it's okay with you guys, there's such a wealth of insights and questions in the document. It'll take me probably a whole day, maybe much longer to absorb everything. So I would actually love to listen to people if that's okay. And maybe Sarah can go first and then others. And I would just love to learn from everyone's insights. And then maybe towards the end, if it's okay, I could just try to summarize things. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Sarah, do you have some things you'd like to say?
So he's cold calling me. Nice. Okay. The Harvard way. So what I will say is, I'll just pick on, because of what interests me particularly in a number of the groups, talking about how some of these, picking up on some of Raj's comments about how some of these structural changes about new ways of working could actually really increase inclusion. We're talking here about dual career. Think about academic dual career couples who are often, really can't live in the same place, but then, now you could live in the same place, and the military couples and things like that. The example of the better mentoring because everyone shares the screen and you're just on Zoom that he gave. I think people really picked up on that. Some of the structural changes that could actually really increase inclusion in organizations. And so I love that people resonated with his comment and developed it further. I see so many comments here. It's a wonderful reflection of this group, how many ideas. There's like 50 paper ideas in here, but I would say mostly work from home could create disadvantages or advantages. But I feel like if we are deliberate and thoughtful about it, and if the research that we do helps uncover these kinds of things, like if we do it right, we can actually make more inclusive workplaces. And if we do it wrong, it could make it worse. And people have raised some of those concerns as well. But I'm really excited about the kinds of research we could do to shed light on what organizations could do to actually make work from home really just better for everybody. So thank you for that. And yeah, there's so many other comments. Anybody in the group in the breakouts want to say anything?
If I can ask a question. First of all, thank you so much, Sarah, Raj, and everyone, and Brad, Samantha, and John for organizing this. I have a question about how do you see working from anywhere as a policy that it's transitory rather than permanent. So it's about workers going to working from anywhere organizations because they can use that to segue into a different career. So they can move and then they're like, oh, I'm moving, I'm working from anywhere, and now I can change your career. So a different career. So, and that would be a little counterintuitive because organizations are promoting a policy that facilitates move rather than facilitates stay. So how do you see that trade-off?
So I can comment on that. I think it's a very intriguing hypothesis, Thomas, and it's something that I think is worthy of study. So just based on my analysis of the US Patent Office examiners and just talking to at least 30 or 40 of them, there were some people clearly trying to do that. So there was a concentration, I showed the map of where people moved, and there was a concentration of examiners near this town in Texas called Marshall. And then I investigated why are so many people moving to Marshall, and turns out that prior to 2015, 80% of the patent lawsuits in the country were being done in that one single courthouse. So these guys were potentially moving there because they wanted to become patent lawyers for patent law firms, litigation firms. But I don't think my hypothesis is not everyone wants to do that. There was also this examiner who moved to Philadelphia, and the reason he was very thankful was his daughter needed a special medical treatment which was available in the Philly hospital. So I think it might increase loyalty as well. So turnover might go both ways, and I think it's a fascinating question that should be studied.
And actually, while you are all in your groups, Raj and I were talking about how this work from anywhere could really de-risk entrepreneurship. So, on the other side of that equation, which is, oh, I want to try this entrepreneurial venture, but I don't want to uproot my whole family and move to Silicon Valley. I can try it out for a year or whatever, and my kids can still stay in their school, and my spouse can still keep their job and everything like that. So I think it could go either way, and understanding those dynamics, I think it's like a fascinating research study.
And just to add one thought to Sarah's point, I recently studied a all remote real estate company called EXP. So this was founded in 2009. And the reason it was founded as an all remote company was the entrepreneur didn't have any money. But because he went all remote, there were two things that was possible. One, there was no sort of like, so a real estate company without its own offices. So I think that was pretty interesting. But they didn't have to raise a lot of early stage equity from VCs. So the owner was able to retain a lot of equity. And then what they did was the real estate savings was partially shared with the real estate agents through higher commissions. So they were able to attract better talent. And turns out today they are valued more than Redfin. I don't think a lot of people know this story. It's a fascinating story of how this absolutely traditional industry company leveraged the all remote model in real estate. Other thoughts, any reflections on the breakout group discussions?
I'd like to pose something, if I may, just quickly.
That's
so just kind of circling back to the kind of the theme, like pandemic effects. You know, we see a lot of Silicon Valley companies kind of early on in this process saying that, you know, during the pandemic, we see that workers are just as productive working from home as they are from the office. So therefore, we will implement this working from anywhere policy where we believe they'll be even more productive. So is there a risk that firms are being short-sighted if they're implementing things too quickly during the pandemic? And for us as scholars, I mean, there's an opportunity there to see maybe productivity differences, you know, in the longer term for those firms that have implemented this policy before the pandemic versus those that have implemented it during the pandemic. And the second point is that there seems to be a selection effect here. So the patent examiners are more productive because they select into working from anywhere. They get those psychological benefits. Is there a difference then when you're forced to work from anywhere? So you can't go to the office anymore. I mean, most people hate working from, well, not most, but I don't like working from home. I wouldn't want to be forced into working from anywhere.
The data suggests that the productivity increase of white collar workers in the United States is about 5% during the pandemic. So my guess is that's primarily because of the not commuting, because people have just so much more time and not putting on makeup or clothes, basically. It takes a lot of time out of your day if you don't have to beautify and you can just use the Zoom filter, you know. So I think it's not like, oh, I'm so excited to work from home, but just I'm, you know, so whether you like it, I'm unlike you, John, I like to work at home, but yes, there could be selection, but we're seeing on average that the productivity is really increased.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. So great question, John. So I think two reflections. One, work from anywhere doesn't mean you're working from home. So, you know, so this project I'm doing with Tulsa Remote, where Tulsa, and they started in 2018, they offered $10,000 for remote workers to come to Tulsa and live there. So they were relocating from Austin or New York to Tulsa. But they actually, the Tulsa Remote organization invested heavily in a co-working space called 36 Degrees North. So these remote workers were actually working in the co-working space. And the same story I found repeated in Mob Squad, which is a Canadian company. And their business model was to find talented foreign workers in the US who had not been able to renew their green card or H-1B visa. And they negotiated a deal with the Canadian government saying, if we can move these folks to Canada, can you ensure a visa is given to them within 2 weeks? And so they moved them to Calgary and Halifax. They got them visas. The worker was still working for the American company, but now living and paying taxes in Canada. But they built co-working spaces. And the final thing I'll say is that there's a really interesting company called Kodai, C-O-D-I, which you might find interesting. They're building an Airbnb model for co-working spaces. And the model is, if you have an empty working desk in your house, you can rent it out to your neighbors. So, and this might really help people who want some change of place, or they don't have 2 offices in the house. And, all kinds of experiments are being tried out.
I had a quick follow-up on that around mechanism, around burnout. It's the short of it. But so that increase in the patent officers, was that because they were spending more time on those first R&Rs? So were you controlling for time and they were just working more efficiently when they work from anywhere? It's like productivity is good, but at what cost, right? And so to what extent were you looking at that, Raj, or what are your thoughts on that, Sarah, as well?
So I can tell you that it's a great question, Sekou. So we were not able to control for time because technically they were only logging certain time, and the patent office was not allowed, initially at least in 2012, to monitor time. In 2013, they put a presence indicator on everyone's computer. So what we can find is that presence indicator button, inserting that had no additional productivity effects. But we know that they were doing more first office actions. Whether that was more efficient work or more time, we don't know. But I interviewed at least 30 to 40 people, and I'll tell you one story which really struck a chord. There was a woman who relocated from Alexandria, Virginia, to some place in Ohio, small town. And she said she was able to now, for the first time, use daycare because it was a much cheaper location. And with her pay, she was now for the first time able to afford daycare. So I think that would, and I'm not drawing a causal inference based on that one story, but those stories were very powerful in that context. Sarah, do you have any thoughts or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that's come up in both of these conversations is that we don't have one model that's going to work for everyone, right? And some people, like John, want to go into the office and is even wearing like a button-up shirt and a jacket, which is very impressive for Zooming. I did put on a nice top actually today, but I'm still in my sweatpants, don't worry.
This is as smart as I've looked in about 6 months, Sarah.
Yeah. But for some people it really does work. And maybe the insight is that, we're going to have to construct workplaces that optimize around, there's not one size fits all. It's the same thing. I think back to like Nancy Rothbard's work on, work from flexible work and family friendly stuff. And there were 2 different kinds of people. There were people who were, I forget what you called them, integrators and splitters, but there's some people who like to work from home because they wanted to integrate, what they were doing in the household with their work and everything. And other people who were like, I want to work and I don't want to think about home. And then I want to be home and I don't want to think about work. And you couldn't design a policy that, necessarily was going to work for both of those groups, or you're going to have to be very thoughtful about designing policies. So I think we have some theoretical tools already, in our toolkit that might help us get to these questions about who actually is more productive, in this setting and who is less productive. Anecdotally, we hear that some of the younger generation, which I now can safely say I am not a member of, are really struggling at home, really struggling. And so it's one thing for me to say, yeah, I love to sit around in my pajamas, but like that's very different when we think about younger generations of people who are still being socialized into work. So I think we have to think about very intersectionally about these different new ways of working.
And just to add one thought, so Sekou also made a great comment about burnout, and I think Samantha added a link on a new paper coming out on burnout. So, there's I think the asynchronous work model should really be studied by, our group in that context. So, I recently did some work with Doist, which is a synchronous first company. And they have this model where they essentially try to do all their brainstorming asynchronously. And they have outlined 3 main benefits that they found in their own research. So the first benefit is it clears up everyone's schedules. You're not doing calls for everything. The second thing they pointed out is that the introverts really contribute ideas, because the introverts tend to not speak both on a Zoom call or in a conference room. And the third thing they pointed out is that folks tend to make more thoughtful comments. So this goes back to the whole deep work phenomena. And I think that's something that could be studied in the context of burnout.
David has a question.
Yep.
And so one of the things that we talked about just briefly in our group, but that I've been really fascinated about. So my job is in Utah at Brigham Young University. Utah has been, so home prices in Utah are on average up 30% this year. And part of that is because work from anywhere opportunities, there are people from California coming over to Utah because it's in the mountains, they can be close to the ski slope, there's lots of wonderful outdoors, and there's fantastic internet, there Google gigabit Ethernet, Google Fiber is there. And so people can come and do anything they want in Utah, but they're selling their $1 to $2 to $3 million houses and coming to Utah where they can get a house that's 3 times bigger for, $400,000 or $500,000. And so there's this fascinating thing that's happening where home prices are going up really dramatically. And then you have people who are locals who have been in the area for a long time who can no longer afford to buy a home in the place where they've lived forever. And so there's this really interesting redistribution of kind of home equity that's happening associated with working from anywhere that I don't really quite know how to understand, but it seems like it has pretty big implications for the human capital stuff that we're talking about.
That's a great comment, DK. Absolutely.
So related to that, it makes me think about the commercial real estate market, right? And a lot of possibly abandoned corporate offices and campuses. Any thoughts on that?
We're already talking in Toronto about what we're going to do with all these huge office buildings downtown, and can we repurpose them as affordable housing, because we have a housing crisis in Toronto. So that conversation is already happening.
So just to add 2 thoughts. So I think I've heard like a couple of things, Rhett. A great point once again. One of the hypotheses I've heard, and I think it's something that could be tested in different ways, maybe inductively through case studies, but even empirically later through quantitative data. But the hypothesis is that the office will become a location for social interactions. We can work from anywhere, but we'll go to an office to meet other colleagues. And I think one company that has taken that to the heart is Dropbox. So they've taken out all the cubicles and they're building like Dropbox collaboration studios and social spaces. So there's a kitchen where people can come and cook for each other. And there's a band room where you can do music. But just imagine what you could do if you took out all the cubicles, right? So I think that's a hypothesis that could be tested. The other thing I've heard is that, in New York City, I've heard some commercial real estate developers even thinking about, can some of this be repurposed as a residential property? And what that might do to home prices. To DK's point, maybe that's the counter to why home prices might actually in equilibrium not rise. So just 2 thoughts to add.
Gwen, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. I thought there's a way to link what Raj has been pointing us to think about the asynchronous work, and then Sarah pointing us to think about gender-based differences. So I attended the Strategy Science Conference, and there was a paper reporting results based on a lab experiment. So I put that in the chat room for you to think about. But the sort of 10-second commercial headline is that men and women respond very differently to the costs of participating in these online knowledge expert platforms. So men respond if there are economic consequences, but women respond to both social consequences and economic consequences. And the behavior is that the participation and how often we seek resources on these digital platforms is different based on gender.
Thank you, Gwen.
So we're down to the last few minutes. So Raj or Sarah, did you have any final comments you wanted to share before we close up the session?
So I just want to thank everyone. I think this is, if you have, John, we're going to get a copy of this document, right? I would love to read it and absorb it.
Yeah, the plan is it will be fixed up. We can circulate a hard, email you and Sarah a copy, and then it will be posted on the IG website with the video. So
thank you so much. And just my last request, like if you have any remote work paper, please apply to the PTW. Look forward to chatting more. So thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John.
Thank you, team, for organizing this, because I think Raj's and my interventions did dovetail very well together. And this was such a rich conversation, and what a wonderful initiative. It's such a great way to connect with all of you in ways that I guess I actually have been missing and didn't remember, because I've just been in my little cubbyhole here. So thank you for the opportunity, and great to see all of you and get to know new folks and just be connected. So this has been a great morning.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. It's been really stimulating to the guests, and also the participation from everybody else has been really, really superb. So look out for the uploads to the website, and we'll see you. If there's nothing else, we have another one. So Sam's got something to say.
No, that's what I was going to say, John. Go ahead. You are saying it. So.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. So we have another seminar next month. I forget the date exactly, but there'll be an email coming out from the SMS office, and it's about research methods in strategic human capital. So we hope to see many of you there.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. It's a wonderful session.